was a lovely little surprise for these gentlemen, getting an applause just for walking up on stage. The bar for men is so low, isn't it? But welcome to everyone, and thank you for coming to the Australia Institute's first Politics in the Pub for 2025. And what a time it's going to be, I think. I would like to start off by acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay respect to the elders, both past and present. And I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. Now some business, which I haven't had to do before because I'm usually sitting on that side. But of your support, and it means we can keep fighting the good fight, and they can hire people like me, which is nice. If you'd like to support us in delivering high impact research for a better Australia, we would love to have you as a monthly donor, and you can do this via the website. But if you're not in a position to be a monthly donor, don't worry, we have a donate now tap machine at the back of the room, which you can please speak to one of our friendly staff if you'd like to make a donation. But also just your attendance, clicking on the website, engaging with the content, and spreading the message also really helps. Not all help needs to be financial to make a difference. But for the reason that we're all here tonight, I'd like to welcome our guests. We have Senator David Pocock, who should need no introduction in this room. Senator Pocock is an independent senator for the Australian Capital Territory. He has a master's in sustainable agriculture and also a track record as a powerful advocate on issues ranging from climate to marriage equality. After campaigning on a platform of integrity, doing politics differently and making Canberra count, David was successfully elected at the May 2022 federal election. And, well, thank you, yes. And we also are lucky enough to have Tony Windsor, who is a former independent MP for New England in New South Wales. Tony had a 22 career in state and federal politics from 1991 to 2013, and he's a widely respected independent who gave the Nick Greiner government in New South Wales power, and then joined with federal MP Rogue Oakeshott to deliver the Julia Gillard government in favour of Tony Abbott. So please welcome him. Now, when we look at the electoral map, both the major parties are on the nose. When you look at the polls and the primary vote, the most likely outcome on the numbers at this point in time is a hung parliament. At the moment, it looks like on the numbers, it would be a Labor-led hung minority government. That's not absolutely guaranteed. And we thought that it would be a really good time to have a chat to the people who know about what minority government looks like, what the negotiations look like, how a hung parliament operates, and whether it really is the chaos and confusion that we've all been led to believe. So, gentlemen, we know all the lines. Minority government creates chaos and confusion. We need certainty. Governments can only pass their mandate when they have a majority, yada, yada, yada. So what is the truth based on your experiences? Because aren't we kind of always in a minority, given that we have that extra chamber, the Senate, where the government of the day rarely has a majority? I mean, it's not as if there haven't been mass negotiations in this parliament, David.
Yeah, every day in the Senate is minority government. Neither party's had a majority since John Howard in 2007. So there's that constant negotiation when the major parties don't agree. And I think people would be shocked how much they do agree on. They pass a lot of legislation together and will often team up to defeat the whole crossbench on things like, make sure we don't get more money for our gas, gambling reform, lobbying reform, ministerial diaries, a whole bunch of things. They'll vote together. But on the things where there are differences, that's where the crossbench comes into effect. And I guess through negotiation, the thing I see is that you actually get better policy. I think more thought through, more robust policy, because as an independent, you're out there consulting with experts, with the people you represent, and I think often strike a better balance to actually get things through. So the Senate's chaos a lot of the time, but that's definitely not because of minority government, and we're already seeing the fear-mongering from the major parties. They're terrified about what a growing crossbench means, and we saw that in the electoral reform stitch-up. But my experience has been it works better. A bit biased, but I think we get far better outcomes that reflect what Australians want when we actually negotiate.
And Tony, you're fairly experienced in minority government. How do you think it works?
Well, if I could firstly thank you, Amy and David, for the opportunity to be here, and to the crowd that's here. This is the first time I've been back in Canberra for 9 years. I've only been here twice since I left Parliament, so it was good to have a bit of a drive around this afternoon. David made some very important points there, particularly in relation to the Senate, and I think a lot of people tend to forget the Senate in terms of the deliberations. But most of the time, the Senate is a hung parliament, and most of the time, and there's a few crazies there, I'd be the first to say that. Not this guy. This guy deserves great credit for what he's done in the period of time that he's actually been in the Parliament. I think that's quite phenomenal. But in relation to the lower house, every time there's a close Parliament, and nearly every Parliament's close now, whether it be the states or the Commonwealth, people say, oh, nothing will get done, it'll be weak, it'll be chaotic, it'll be unstable, all of those things to describe. And they're doing that purely for political purposes, as you know. They want to have a majority where the executive of the government and those who fund the executive want to be able to ram through their particular agenda. They tend to forget about the Senate when they're talking that language as well. And I think it's very important that all of us think very seriously about how we vote in the Senate as well as the House.
Just on that, Tony, how does the mechanics of determining a government when it is in a minority position actually work? Are you always bound to vote for their legislation, or are you bound at all? Or are there any rules for any of this, or is this just something that the media makes up?
Well, people try and create rules, but I've been in two hung parliaments, one in 1991 when Nick Greiner, the Liberal Premier, took the premiership, and in 2010. I was also in another one with a majority of one in New South Wales, and it was very similar to a hung parliament, because Bob Carr at the time was petrified of losing one seat. So I've had some degree of experience in relation to that. What happens in a hung parliament, though, is that there'll be an election on the Saturday, and I've been talking to a few of the candidates about this particular thing. There's this enormous pressure on people. What are you going to do if, in fact, there is a hung parliament? Who are you going to vote for? Who are you going to support? Which of the major parties? There's media pressure and the pressure of the major parties themselves demanding what, in fact, people may do. Well, it's terribly presumptuous of any candidate to presume they're going to win the seat to start with. And the way I'd answer that particular question these days is, whoever's asking it, say, well, you tell me what the numbers are. Who won this election we haven't had yet, or who's got the most seats? How many have they got? What's been the outcome in the Senate? The Senate's critical again. All of these issues, what were the issues they actually ran on? The media are asking people now what they're going to do in the event of a hung parliament when there's no policies on the table. All of these things have got to come into consideration. But one of the things I have been saying is there is a third option. There's this view that you either have to support the Labor Party or the Liberal Party. Well, you don't. You don't have to at all. And in fact, Rob Oakeshott and I look very serious at doing this, not supporting anybody in 2010. And the major reason we didn't do that was that we were concerned, very few living people had actually experienced the hung parliament at the federal level. So there was real concern whether something could actually work. So we thought it was best to send a message after that 15 or 16 days to the public that we thought a government could be formed and that we would support supply and confidence for Julia Gillard. Outside that, and that agreement's not where the paper's written on. If anybody says, oh, I've got an agreement from so-and-so to support supply and confidence, and only not do so in terms of, in the circumstances of maladministration or corruption, that paper is worthless. Has no legal standing, it really has no political authority, but it does give guidance to the community in terms of what the intention is. But the important point I'd like to leave, in a sense, tonight is that the independent candidates that are standing really should treat that question as ridiculous as it is, and realise that they have the capacity not to support either side and remain truly independent in terms of the political process. The major parties keep saying from time to time, we won't do any deals with anybody. We don't want to deal with anybody. Well, take them at their word. Don't do a deal with them. And let them scrub it out in the chamber as to the formation of a government. And then, quite rightly, as all independents that I've seen in particular parliaments do, those independents will support the right of that government to have access to supply and confidence. All else is on the table, and so it should be. And David's a classic example of that in the Senate, but you'd see that in the House of Reps with the independents voting on different issues and creating leadership on a whole range of issues.
How do these negotiations work? So how does it work in the Senate? Does someone just knock on your door and be like, hey, with some food, and then talks to you about a bill, and then you go, yeah, cool, I'll support that? I say food because I'm Lithuanian, and if I didn't come to somebody's house with food, the ghost of my ancestors would eat me, so I just assumed that this is something that happens everywhere.
Sounds like how it should work, but no, it varies wildly from minister to minister. Some are super proactive, will reach out early, will offer briefings, keen to sit down and talk about issues, kind of work out the starting points of what I'm thinking, what other crossbenchers are thinking versus what they want to do. And then others, I think, forget that there is a Senate and have a bit of an oh shit moment when the legislation's on its way to the Senate and you're getting frantic calls and saying, well, it's not my bill. I need to go and consult on it and do all those things. So it really varies, and I would have liked to have said that Labor have got better at it over the term, but I don't think they have. I've found it strange the lack of focus on the growing crossbench, and I thought it was really telling the legislation they rammed through on the last day. That I think really shows their attitude, and they'll talk about the parties of government and how we are a Westminster system, but there's absolutely nothing in our constitution that talks about the parties. And when it comes to the Prime Minister of the day, really it could just be up to the Parliament.
So when do you know that you're in play? Like, what's the pressure like? So let's take housing, for instance. That was something everyone knew that the coalition had said no to. So that means that the government has no choice but go to the crossbench. What's the difference like when suddenly they need X number of votes from that crossbench in the Senate?
Well, there's obviously a lot more pressure. It's a lot more fun too, because you have that leverage and you want to use it for good, to actually talk to experts, talk to Canberra and say, hey, this piece of legislation, one, is it good? How can we make it better? And I think we saw that with housing. I didn't agree with some of the politicking the Greens were doing on it. I thought it was deliberately obstructionist. I agreed with some of their things about the need for far more investment in social and affordable housing. When I actually got down to negotiations, there were, I mean, I think one of the amendments I got was, ends up being an extra $6.3 billion when you sort of add it over the life of the half, and the Greens got more money. So yeah, it's an interesting process, and as I said, it varies wildly from minister to minister. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed is being able to engage across the Parliament on different issues. You know, there were a number of times in the Senate over the last 3 years where the coalition and the entire crossbench passed bills against the government's will, either things that they didn't want to do or that we all thought this is a good idea, you guys should be doing it. So I think to me that's what a democracy can be and should be.
And Tony, we saw some of that in the 43rd Parliament, where we had the most number of bills passed, I think, by Parliament, and some major reforms. There was the carbon charge, RIP to that. There was the NDIS. There was the establishment of the Royal Commission into Childhood Sexual Abuse. And yet, if you talk to most people, then they will have a memory of chaos and confusion. But not a single bill was lost on the floor of House of Representatives. And by the time it got to the Senate, much of the negotiation had been done, so then it was just about rounding out some of that negotiations with some other independent senators then. So what was your experience of the negotiations?
There was a lot of working between the two houses, and David made some very significant points there a moment ago in terms of how the system works. But in that particular hung Parliament, a lot of legislation was passed. I don't necessarily agree that the number of bills passed indicates how good the Parliament particularly was. But it worked hard, there's no doubt about that. And there was a lot of interconnectivity between the House and the Senate before bills sometimes were even introduced. And I found that really encouraging. That I think one thing that came out of it was, and David would probably agree, is that the independents slowed the process down a bit. And I remember making a statement to Julia Gillard and Anthony Albanese when they, you know, around Christmas time, there's always urgency. Oh, we've got to get this stuff through. You've got to, oh, David, Tony, you've got to think about it. I made the point, well, if you're going to apply this sort of pressure, where my vote is significant, the answer is no. Very early on in the point, the answer is no. I'll vote against it. If I'm not fully aware of what it actually means, and refer to, as David mentioned, the experts that are out there. And one of the real advantages of being an independent, in my sense, is that there's a lot of very, very decent people who have knowledge in a whole range of areas that are only too willing to help, who don't want money for helping. And that's a significant input that they make into the Parliament. The other thing that a lot of people don't recognise only is the makeup of the committee system in a hung Parliament. And that was one of the most fascinating things for me to actually watch. I actually chaired one of the committees, but in a hung Parliament, the committee membership, the makeup of the committees is reflected by that nature. The executive government that normally occurs in a majority circumstance doesn't have control of the outcomes of the committees. Because a lot of committee work in the House is done, very genuine work. And then the government of the day will move in and say, well, we're not supporting those recommendations, and tell their people to vote against it. Well, I'll just give you one quick example. And when people say, oh, independence is useless, I can't do anything, you know, hung Parliaments, all the yabba yabba yabba, as you put it. I chaired a committee looking at the Murray-Darling Basin Committee. The government didn't have a majority on it. The opposition were on it. It reflected the makeup of that particular Parliament. But what it also did, and this happened across a whole range of committees, is that it empowered all the members on those committees to actually get serious about an issue for once, because they didn't have the guided missile people at the back of them. They'd start to examine the issue, and I think that's what David was referring to then in terms of, you know, getting to the nub of the issue and improving the outcome. Now, when people say, oh, you'll never get anything done in a hung Parliament, for 100 years, the various state governments that had some degree of ownership or control over the Murray-Darling system and the federal government could never agree always because of politics. And it took this weak, feeble, unstable, little Gillard government with a few independents on it to reach a point where legislation was passed. A lot of that the recommendations of legislation came out of the committee process. And the National Party were involved in it, the Liberal Party were involved in it. Everybody was involved in it, and that empowered the legislative process. And I think you'll see more of that in hung parliaments as time goes on, because the independents across benches are more interested in the outcome of real issues than the politics. And just in conclusion, because it came into my empty brain, I often say the good thing about having an independent is it's not hard to get rid of them. But it's very difficult to get rid of some people in the major parties in some of the very, very safe seats.
Barnaby Joyce, for example. David, why do you think it's kind of taken to this point for people to start looking at independence again? Because as you rightly point out, there is nothing in the Constitution that says the Labor Party have to exist and govern, or the coalition has to exist and govern, and yet most voters would first go to one of those major parties when they think about politics, when they think about candidates. So what do you think it is about this moment that's made people go, maybe there is something else outside of this two-party system, given that we've had plenty of economic and social disruption in previous decades as well?
It's a good question. I'm probably not the best person to answer it. I think one of the things I see in Parliament House, and then talk to Canberrans, and when I travel around to talk to Australians about, our current setup's not working for us. Regardless of who's in government, they're making short-term decisions. And when you make short-term decisions, you can maybe get by for long enough, but it catches up with you. And I think it has well and truly caught up with us. From housing to a cost of living being driven by an economy that has so little competition in it, to climate, to just our tragic biodiversity crisis, this extinction crisis that we're in, and the major parties are still in denial about it. We've just gone through 3 years of a Labor government that promised the world and delivered absolutely nothing for nature. And I think more and more Australians are saying, well, what's the point of voting for someone who may be a lovely local member, says all the right things, and then gets in there and votes for the expansion of the gas industry, votes to not get more from the gas that we're exporting. And at the same time, I think we've seen independents like Tony, like Cathy McGowan, like Helen Haynes, Zali and others, actually standing up for their community on issues that are important to their community. And the thing that I see is if you actually listen to Australians, doesn't matter where you are in the country, there's a whole bunch of things that people agree on. We actually have far more in common than our differences. Major parties will focus on those differences. And I think what I see with the independents doing is saying, well, hang on, we actually agree on a lot that isn't getting done. That's surely the starting point for us. So my hope is that we see more and more in there. I really see it as this incredibly important sort of self-correcting mechanism in our democracy that forces the major parties to go back to their roots and who they're meant to be representing. Again, to come back to electoral reform, rather than doing that, they're just trying to lock us out. But hopefully Australians recognise that, and we've got the next term of Parliament to try and correct that.
So Tony, what happened in 2014? Like, what happened to stop the independent movement in terms of being taken seriously by voters? Was the media to blame? Was it the major parties both turning against independence despite the fact that the parliament had been eminently workable and had been achieving things that people wanted? Like, what went wrong?
Well, I can't remember back that far. I thought 2014 was pretty good. Not politically. Lynn and I had a good year anyway. The political system is absolutely threatened if either side can't control the House, the government. And that's about money, and that's about media, in terms of guiding people to have views of circumstances and the negative nature. And we're seeing it now. We're seeing it played out around the world. We're seeing it with Trump and others. The system that we put our faith in has been weakened considerably over time. And what I think is happening in terms of the communities are waking up, and they're starting to say, well, we don't have to put up with this. We can put a decent person in there that actually thinks about the issues and reflects back to us. You know, I've had to say for many years that the world is run by those who turn up. And that's what we've got to keep doing. We've got to keep turning up. People, I talk to a lot of people, I say, oh, I'm disgusted in politics. I don't know how you can stay interested in unless you stay interested, unless you stay involved, unless you start to turn up and get involved, and you can do that through the community processes that are existing these days. Unless you do that, you end up with a world like Trump. That sort of nonsense can come to this place too. So that is a threat. These community independents, other independents as well, the various crossbenchers, but they are a threat to what the political system and the owners of the major parties think is something that they own. Well, democracy is a bit different to that, and I think we've got to make sure that we reclaim it at every step of the way that we can.
I think one of the points that Tony is making so well is that it's not just the major parties who don't like minority government. Today there was a fairly long article that was quoting at length the CEOs of Woodside and Beach Energy about how terrible a minority government would be for Australia and future, and the lack of certainty about the expansion of the gas industry. And I think truly this is what we're up against. There are industries that are making a lot of money by destroying our future, and the major parties are facilitating that at the moment. And that doesn't align with what I hear from what most Australians want, but that's probably not what you're going to hear in the media.
And you've mentioned it a couple of times tonight, the electoral reforms, inverted commas, which essentially do lock out independents and minor party candidates who aren't already in the parliament from the next full 2028 election onwards. Do you think that that is the biggest indication of how terrified the major parties and some of their backers are of this trend of independents and potentially minority governments for the foreseeable future, how terrified they are of that prospect?
You'd have to say so. I mean, their primary vote's been declining for a long time now. And yes, they figured they had the numbers to stitch it up. There's undoubtedly some good things in this bill around transparency, lowering the disclosure threshold, real-time disclosures, things that we should have done years ago. But it's just loophole upon loophole that means that it's just totally stacked in favour of the major parties.
Yeah, years ago, we had the two major parties. This is how I sort of explain it in most simplistic terms. One represented the worker and the other one the boss. When the various activities of Paul Keating and Bob Hawke with labour reforms came through, it sort of took a lot of that out of politics. So since then, the last 20 or 30 years, both sides have been struggling to find out what they actually believe, what they actually represent. So you had this crazy circumstance in 2010, 11, 12, where the bastions of the market system nearly killed people to stop a market price being applied to carbon, the emissions trading scheme, a market mechanism. So now we have this sort of desperate attempt to find out what divides people that can give us an opportunity to knock the other side off. So it's all focus groups, it's all this nonsense they carry on with to find a division. David made a point there earlier. Most a lot of the issues, it's not hard to find consensus if you're looking for it. But what we tend to do, the 93% of stuff we agree on, the 93% we agree on, we search for something that becomes a division. Climate change, one, it's way out there, it'll never affect us. Way out there, let's vote for the short term again. The way in which we develop our telecommunication systems, all of those issues, capital gains tax and negative gearing, those sorts of issues, they've got to happen. We've got to start to address some of those significant taxation issues, and I take my hat off to people like Allegra Spender and others that are actually starting to deal with that. The people are going to get behind it. It will create change, but instead of being weak and unstable and chaotic, I see the upside where hung parliaments can actually drive some of the harder decisions through a consensual approach to the way they address those issues and those decisions.
It does depend on the crossbench though, right? Like all of this depends on the crossbench, because is there a threat that important voices or consensus voices don't get heard if there's a couple of old reliables sitting on the crossbench who are just going to give whoever the governing party is of the day their vote?
I don't think there'll be silence. So there's certainly, the government's always looking for the easiest votes. So if there's an issue that doesn't really matter to a senator, they're happy just to vote for it. They're going to lock them in early. But you've still got a voice in there, and I think when the crossbench really represents their communities and does so in a way where people are actually proud to have them as a representative, it's hard not to respect that, and I think the major parties end up wanting their vote. It's kind of a bit of a stamp on their legislation that, we got the crossbench. And again, sorry to come back to electoral reform, but they were so desperate to just get one amendment from the crossbench. Why aren't you putting up amendments to our crappy bill? And basically said to them, because you're going to accept something that the Lips want, and then you're going to say, well, look, the crossbench, got an amendment, so we got multi-partisanship. So, yes, I think that's a risk. I think one of the bigger risks, if you look at countries that have parliaments that are constantly sort of working in minority, they have far more diversity in the media. And I think that's really going to be a challenge in a minority government, is how do you have a more nuanced policy debate in the media and not, as happened around something like the carbon price, just have an awful pylon that just totally skews the public's view on something that is a market mechanism to deal with one of the biggest challenges we face.
And if you ever want to know exactly how politics works, I recommend that you read Peter Credlin and Barnaby Joyce's books and their chapters on the carbon charge, where they both admit that it was complete bullshit, their campaign against it, and it was just a great line and they just continued it. And at the moment that Peter Credlin decided to start calling it a tax and everyone in the media started calling it the carbon tax instead of the carbon price, was the moment that they knew that they had won. Is there anyone in the audience who has any questions? Sure, if you'd like to just step up here. I will just ask, just so we can try and get as many as possible, that it does have a question mark at the end.
I've got a few questions, but there's one I definitely know I want to ask, and a few others I think I need to ask. Yeah, sorry. How do independents, well, first off, gain their following and then maintain it through their entire time in Parliament?
So is that, how do they gain the votes and then maintain those votes? Is that what you mean by following?
Not votes, more financial supporters.
How do independents gain donors and then maintain donors?
I still don't understand it.
How do independents, given that you're away from the major parties, how do you find people to donate to your campaigns, and how do you maintain those donors throughout your time in Parliament, given that you're not holding regular fundraising events like the major parties do?
Yeah, well, they do have some fundraisers. I was very fortunate. Besides having a very good staff, which is critical, I had a lot of people supporting me. Our sort of inner group was over 1,000 people. Not one of them asked for a favour. Not one. Over 22 years asked for some sort of political favour. I hope to get some money, how about you help me? Which is a great credit to them. It's a people thing. We needed money at elections, there's no doubt about that, and that's becoming harder and harder to be really competitive with all of the streams of media, etc. But we never set out to compete with the major parties. You can't do that. So your strength is your community. Gina Reinhardt gets one vote. My 1,000 supporters, they're all going to vote, and their kinship and others, friends, that's where the power really comes from. That you need some money, but you don't need massive quantities of it.
I think what we've seen come out of Indi with Cathy McGowan and Helen Haynes is community groups forming that then look for a candidate, and so when you agree to become the candidate or go through the process, you then have hundreds of people who are on board, have been looking for someone to run, and that's a bit of a starting base. That was certainly the case with me with ProAct that had formed here in the ACT, and I think Canberra had one of the highest percentage of contributors to Climate 200, so Canberrans giving money. At the last election, I took money from Climate 200. So, people are. It's pretty humbling seeing how much time and effort and money people are willing to put into something that they just believe in, and they want to see change, and they want to see politics done differently, and they don't expect anything in return. I think, it's a pretty incredible thing.
Di Lee, an independent, beat a titan of Labor, Christina Keneally, in her seat with donations up to $80,000, and then she chipped in another $80,000 of her own. So it was basically $160,000, $170,000 against all of Labor's campaign money, and still won the seat of Fowler.
Thanks all for coming. My question's, what's the risk of a crossbencher, independent, etc., or small party being influenced by the big parties to buy a vote in exchange for something that they want? Now, I recall a case with Jackie Lambie. I think she had to sell her soul to get her private bill passed at some point. There's that, from what I understand, what David said, you can negotiate when you've got the power as an independent or a crossbencher to get amendments, but if you have to sell your soul, horse trading, if you wish, how prevalent is it, and is it a danger to us when we push towards a stronger crossbench?
I think it's out there, but it's not as big a thing as what I think's made out. There are circumstances where it could, the exchange of issues occurs. You support this, and I'll support that. But I don't think it happens as much these days. David might have a different view, and it will happen with certain candidates as well. I wouldn't say that every independent in the Parliament is the best thing since sliced bread. That's why I think it's important that the community initiate. It's the representative of the community that's important. Our founding fathers knew that. There were no parties. They were representatives of the community in the House of Representatives. In a spacist form, all these people, most of whom probably didn't have much contact with each other early on, would come to Canberra, then make a decision as to whether there were enough people to form a government, and then all get on with the issues. The parties polluted the system in a certain extent, 20 or 30 years later particularly, in that they started to see, well, all of this negotiating with people, this odd. If we formed into two tennis courts, two sides of the tennis court, we could actually circumvent a lot of this stuff and just do what we want to do. And I think we've gone through that, and we're coming back out the other side now, where the community are saying, no, our system wasn't designed to be like this, to be owned by a few people. It's owned by us, and we've had a gutful of this sort of activity.
Do you find that perhaps independents who have sold their soul are very accountable to the community?
I mean, I don't think I've seen cases of that happening in this Senate with big pieces of legislation. My commitment, and I think it very much is the relationship you have to the people you represent, and that kind of contract you have, really. You elect me, and my commitment to Canberra is I'm going to take each piece of legislation on its merits. I'm going to get across it, I'm going to consult, find out what people think, and then use whatever leverage I have to improve it and get things that I know that Australians and Canberrans want. So some people might say that's horse trading, but yeah, I think it's very much person to person.
Thanks. What do you see as the role of the Greens in a minority government?
Well, I don't know in the lower house. I don't know what that would look like. I know in the Senate, if the coalition's against it, then currently it's Labor, the Greens, +3. So critical. They're absolutely critical to passing things. I think it'd be total speculation to even say what would happen if Labor needed 4 or 5 votes, who they'd go to.
I'm yet to actually see a party of government turn down support in order to get them into the government. Like, you know, they do all say, we're not going to do a deal, not going to get to a deal. If they're short on the numbers, you can absolutely guarantee they'll do a deal.
Just on that issue though, a government doesn't have to have a majority or some promissory notes to get it over 75 to form a government. It doesn't have to go down that path. That's what the media is selling. You know, someone's got to get to 75 and 76 and all's well. And therefore we need to know exactly what you're going to do, the independent candidate. The mechanism is that the election day is held on a Saturday. It'll be a fortnight, if it looks like a hung parliament, it'll be a fortnight before the polls declared, so that the crossbenchers have plenty of time to examine what's going on, what's happening in terms of the budgetary positions that were put at the election, all of those things. And they can use that time to advantage. Now, under our constitution, what would happen next if the newspapers didn't have 73 plus 3 have committed? What would happen is that the Prime Minister of the day, we don't actually stop government when there's election on. The Prime Minister of the day could in fact, and Julia Gillard could have done this if we hadn't given her those promissory notes, she could have assembled the Parliament and remained the Prime Minister until such time as there was a no confidence vote in it. There is no vote of confidence. You don't put both sides of the footy field on and everybody puts their hand up, I want him to be the captain, in which case I'd vote for him. But it doesn't happen that way. So, and in certain circumstances there may well be an immediate vote of no confidence in whoever the Prime Minister happens to be. Or, as in, if you look at history, I can't remember one independent in the parliaments I was in and the other hung parliaments that I've sort of watched from the sidelines on, where independents have actually supported a no confidence motion in a government that hasn't done anything. It would be highly unlikely. Now, in the hung parliament, at the last one I was involved in, Tony Abbott never moved a no confidence motion in Julia Gillard, even though the press was always on about, oh, they've got no confidence in these people, they can't do anything. Just a little addendum to that, that's coming out of the conversation is that in a hung parliament, a lot of things don't happen. You don't see those in the paper. The governments are petrified, that David was talking about there earlier, are petrified of losing stuff on the floor of the House. So, if, say, the nuclear debate came up, for instance, would you support legislation if we bring in the nuclear energy? If they get a whiff that the numbers are saying no, nuclear energy will suddenly find some other need for 3 or 4 years to get it past the cycle again, and then wrestle with another group in the parliament to try and get stuff happening. So it's a lot of the time it's the stuff that independents prevent from happening, the bad things that could happen, rather than voting for or against particular pieces of legislation.
My question is related to the fact that it's roughly a third of coalition, Labor and crossbench. But my sense is that with the legislation that's passed, it's been more often that the Labor has been in coalition with the coalition in passing stuff. It could be confirmation bias, but I'm not as conscious of stuff that's been passed with the crossbench. But there's no way to find out. Like I don't see on the Parliament website or Google searching or whatever. How do you find out whether the Labor government is been operating mostly in coalition with the coalition?
Parliament House has a pretty good website that will have all the divisions. But
you have to sort of look at every legislation. There's no statistical analysis or.
There is at the end of each year. There is a statistical analysis of how many bills were passed, who passed the bill. You can see on each piece of legislation who voted for it, the ayes and the noes, which does help give an idea of that. It is normal, though, for most bills to pass with a bipartisan consensus. And that is because most
bipartisan, not tripartisan.
No, sometimes even tripartisan, because it's the machinery of government, the machinery of policy. The bills that you hear about are the ones where there's not necessarily tripartisan agreement, and that's why you're hearing about it. So pick the bills, pick the issues that you're interested in, and then go and look who voted on what issue, and that'll tell you whether the major parties banded together on something or whether the crossbench was involved.
What's your sense?
There's certainly been, I think if you probably look at volume of bills, there's a whole bunch of things that no one ever hears about and probably doesn't care about that just go through, sometimes without a vote in the Senate. I think on the big things, the coalition has basically opposed almost everything, apart from a few bills around petroleum resource. Right, actually, I think they actually opposed that too. But big things, industrial relations, housing, some climate legislation early on, that was all done through the crossbench. So there has been a lot of negotiation and passing of bills. Yeah.
Thanks. I've got a comment and a question. So I'm Dr. Lindy Edwards. I'm a researcher at University of New South Wales, and I did the biggest study on corporate influence in Australian politics since the 1980s. And for those that are going, look, we've got a couple of vested interests up here saying independents do a great job, I'd like to say that the outcome of my research was that actually independents really are an important and incredibly valuable check in the system. So that's my comment. And to the woman speaking before going, oh my God, it's hard to work out what's going on. I actually went and did the study because I couldn't work it out either. I was sitting there going, is it how it looks? So that was my comment. My question. So arguably, Australian politics went to shit 20 years ago when the political strategists realised that the swinging voters are the people who don't know what's going on and don't understand. And that we've had an extended period of the major party strategists focusing their messages and their policy at the people who aren't paying any attention. And the community independents have been an incredibly important and valuable sort of safety valve, in the sense that, to be honest, the people who voted for them are the people who are paying attention, and it has been a way in which the people who are paying attention can put a check on the major parties. But this sense that we have at the moment, and I know it's certainly my sense, as somebody who used to write a lot of op-eds for newspapers, but now it feels like our politics is no longer a reasoned debate. Like, it feels like there's no point in being part of the conversation, because there's not a rational conversation about what the public good is that's going on anymore. And there's a risk of just, you know, I mean, particularly you look at the US at the moment and you just rock back on your heels and go, wow, how do you participate in a constructive way? So my question to you guys is, in that context, like, I mean, once you're in Parliament House and you're looking at the legislation, you've got that sense of being a part of something productive. But in terms of keeping the wider community engaged in the political process and not being disillusioned by what's going on by the major parties, what's your sense about how it is that we keep people engaged?
It's a huge question, something that my team and I talk about a lot. How do you reach people in an age where less and less people are reading a newspaper or watching the evening news, and they're getting their news on Instagram and TikTok and other platforms? And how do you actually have conversations and get information out there? But then as a society, how do we actually deal with difference and grapple with big thorny issues that we have to as a country, but we're more and more being served our own views from others that sort of reinforce that the algorithms are just feeding us things that we kind of agree with, and I think that is leading to this polarization. So I think we've got a huge task ahead of us in the way that we demand more transparency from big social media companies about what they're actually doing to our societies. They know very well what they're doing. What I've seen, neither of the major parties have the guts to actually stand up to the big multinationals. So I don't know, I think it's a really tough one.
John Howard, back in the 90s, started it because of the worker and the boss, Liberal versus Labor thing was dissipating. He was quite clever. He went after what he called the aspirationals, and it really singled out a group, and you can see Dutton doing some now, but in that last 20 or 30 years, there's been more and more of the political targeting of groups and the technologies that to do it now. And we saw it with the Voice, where there was a lot of money went into targeting specific groups and trying to influence their outcomes. Much of the time, it's had nothing to do with the Voice, but all this other extraneous material was brought in to try and pollute the pool. And that's the big thing we're fighting against, because they're creating divisions now. It's not about philosophy anymore. It's about creation of visions. You see the backroom people, they brag about it. You talk about Credlin and my good friend Joyce, who I'm supporting. I want him to be in Melbourne and Brisbane and Sydney talking to the people about all of the issues. So that's an aside. I visited your piece of concrete today. It's very good. Still a stain on the footpath. But, so it's this division that's more and more around today. Years ago, when the media was much simpler and mainly fair, those days are gone. And we can all say anything on social media now. trying to influence people.
I'm a little bit more optimistic. I know that both major parties and those political research groups and focus groups are picking up major discontentment with the major parties. People don't like Labor, but that's not going to the coalition. They don't like the Liberals or the National Party either. And when you look at votes like what happened in Werribee in the recent state election, you saw Labor drop down about 10 points or so and almost lose the seat. That did not translate to the coalition. That vote went to independents and to minor parties, and that is being extrapolated all over the place. So when you read the polls, you can see the primary votes of the major parties are declining. Even in the news poll, the coalition's major, its primary vote is declining. It's just polls aren't particularly great at measuring they're not great at measuring independents or minor party votes. It's happening. The vibe shift is happening. So if you feel a certain way and you find that the community is also feeling a certain way, you can bet that other communities are too.
And Amy, one of the things I found really interesting is if you look on social media, you think we're so divided, everything's polarised. My experience has been when you actually talk to people, there's this big chunk of Australians in the middle saying, just get on with things, guys. Find a way forward. And for me, that's what I've loved so much about being a community independent is you're meeting so many people talking about the issues that matter to us, and you don't pick up that same. I mean, social media is a couple percent on either side, just slinging mud at each other all day and night.
I apologise because this question will be a bit of a counterfactual. You've talked a little bit today about how the two major parties have moved away from what they intend to represent. If that weren't the case and there were parties that genuinely stood for the principles they were based on in this fictional reality, sad though it may be, do you reckon you would join a party that stood for the interests that you were a part of, whether it was major or middling? Or do you think that, being an independent is what matters more?
I mean, I personally would have absolutely no interest in it. I didn't beforehand, and there's a few people in this room who talked me into running. And I was only interested in doing it as an independent because I can just listen to the community I represent and make a decision. And I've seen how hard it is on good people in the major parties who really believe in an issue, work their guts out, put all the work in, and then when it comes to the vote, they get pushed aside and they say, actually, the focus group say this, or actually just politically expediency, we're doing this. So, no, not for me.
Tony, did you ever want to join?
During the 1980s, I was a card-carrying member of the National Party. And one of the things, in my 30s, a father figure to me, my father died when I was quite young, but father figure to me said, oh, you seem to be interested in politics, you better get interested with these people, which I did. And later in the 80s, I showed some discontent from a branch, and there was a black mark against me in that circumstance. But I found, I was never in a parliament as a member of a party, but I just found that you had that real freedom to negotiate directly from the community to the parliament, to the ministers, to whoever, irrespective of whether you agreed with what your constituent was saying or not. We represented them. And I found that to be the most important part of the job. I was a member of the House of Representatives. I didn't have a particular Guernsey on. And I think that beige shirt was probably the best one to have in the sense that you could represent people who normally, if you were in a party, they would pigeonhole you. That's, oh, you're this, you're that. There's too much of that goes on. A lot of the issues aren't black and white. They can be negotiated. So no, I'm too old anyway.
And final question.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, David, for being here. Quick question from me. I had an interesting conversation with Bob Catter the other day where he talked about another famous independent.
What day did you start the conversation?
There's no boring conversations.
There is no boring conversation with Bob Catter. I had a chat with Bob, and he talked about the relationship he had with the Leader of the House, Anthony Albanese, in that 2010 Parliament. And one of the reasons why so much legislation got done was Albanese's work as Leader of the House in getting legislation passed. We now have Tony Burke and Penny Wong leading the government's negotiations in the House and the Senate, and we have Michaelia Cash and Michael Sukkar leading the opposition's negotiations in the House and Senate. Given that politics is a people's game and a relationship game, how do you think a minority situation would go, given some of the leading figures in Labor and Liberal Party, in actually having a productive and successful government based on your experience, Tony, in 2010 and David, your experience in the Senate currently?
Yeah, well, I think Peter Dutton would struggle. I know Peter, we went into the Parliament the same day. But he's very much a Tony Abbott player, not a consensual negotiator, not a Gillard. He actually plays his politics like rugby, in my view. It's incremental, daily game, not long-term World Cup stuff. I think he'd struggle. Tony Burke I know quite well. I was involved with the Murray-Darling Basin plan with him. He has that capacity. Actually, Albanese has that capacity as well. And I'm sure there are people in the coalition that would have that capacity, but they just don't come to mind. but that's I've got a bit of Trump mentality, so.
Come on, Angus Taylor, Tony Hassan, Susan Lay.
But I've got to tell you a story about Bob Catter. He was extraordinary. During the negotiations for a hung parliament, Oakeshott and I took it very seriously, and Bob came along to a lot of the meetings. We thought, rather than have 3 meetings, let's have one. That was our big mistake. And I remember we had a 5-hour meeting there one day, and we were looking at the economic circumstances and what was being presented by the major parties. And Ken Henry was there, and the Treasury officials. Everyone of any importance in government was there. And Bob wouldn't shut up about ethanol.
He's still going on it.
I was very good at it. I remember when Craig Emerson, sorry to do this, when Craig Emerson was made junior minister, he used to sit towards the end, near the crossbenchers, and we used to encourage him, Craig, you've got to lift a bit more when you get up at question time today. We'd hope that he'd have a question, and he would lift, he'd get a bit excited, and halfway through his question. One day, and I hope you don't hold this against me, but one day I got one of my staff to print out all these cards, about a foot by a foot, scorecards, 0 to 10. And I gave Oakeshott and Bob one, and a couple of the Nats took them, just the people around us, Adam Brown. And there were about 8 or 10 of us. And the first time we were going to score, Craig, he got up and made his speech and sat down. I gave him a 4. You might notice on Twitter I still banter with Craig Emerson about 8s and 9s eventually. Bob held his up, which was a 5 upside down. and Harry Jenkins was the speaker. And of course, you're not supposed to introduce this material into the House, it's a sin, but he gave us as much time as he possibly could. And he said, the member for New England will stop this, words to that effect. And the member for Kennedy, I think, may well reflect on the education system in Queensland. in Queensland. After that, I got all Bob's scorecards out, and then anything that could be confused, 6 or a 9. I wrote on the bottom, up this way, stupid. Everybody loves Bob.
David, do you have something on who would be good to negotiate with?
I've done a lot of negotiation with Tony Burke. Found him very good to negotiate with and work with. Very sort of upfront, proactive. Done quite a bit with Michaelia Cash too, on various things in the Senate, and I'm sure a minority government would probably change the way that they interact with the crossbench. I think it'd be fascinating. I think the thing that in there is when you're actually up close with people, you realise this is just other people, and you may not agree on a whole bunch of things, but there's so much you can agree on, and that's very much been my approach as an independent. Is I'll work with anyone across the parliament, take them at face value. We'll see.
Well, as a product of the Queensland school system, I can tell you that we've run over time because I know my numbers. So thank you very much to everyone who came along. Thank you to Tony Windsor and to David Pocock for generously sharing the time. We've got a lot of exciting events coming up at the Australia Institute, especially as we roll towards that federal election, also known as my daily existential meltdown. So please check our webpage for more details. Also, the Australia Institute is now live blogging Parliament and will be live blogging the election campaign as well. So you can tune in to that for an alternative media sort of view, along with some research and some fact checking as well. And we are selling the best-selling Australia Institute book, the first one of the Australia Institute Press, What's the Big Idea? I'm a contributing author, which happened before I was at the Australia Institute, which was quite nice. These are the last hard copies available, so if you'd like to grab one, please do. But I really wanted to take a moment to thank each and every single one of you who came out tonight. It's so important to fight for your democracy. I didn't think that at this point in my life that I would be having to fight for my democracy. I was like, oh, I just thought it would be neoliberalism and housing. But no, it turns out it's actual democracy and fighting against fascism. Who knew? So thank you to everyone who came out, particularly those who came out with young children. It's so difficult at times. So thank you for coming and contributing to your democracy, and please do good and take care of you.